Um, Great. Okay. So this is what we're going to be talking about today, the discipline of development economics and the colonial encounter. And I am going to talk a little bit broadly about this issue, but then get into some more details of the issue of labor and informalities, specifically drawing from illustrations from India based on my work. At any point, if you have any questions, do just stop me, because at some point, if you're like, okay, this doesn't make any sense, whatever you're saying, so just you can raise your hand and be like, can you explain that again? If there are more questions which are more discussion based, we'll take that at the end. So please do not hesitate to ask me to clarify anything. All right. So let's look at what the format of today's talk will be. I'm going to begin with what is the dominant understanding of economic development, and how is it that what we call, what we say as Eurocentrism is something that is prevalent in it. I'll talk about informal economy, I'll define it, and I'll talk about why that is an important illustration as we begin unpacking this particular theme. And I'll talk about how is it that this issue of informal economy is understood in the literature, both from Eurocentric and non-Eurocentric thoughts. And then I will try to push the discussion forward based on what are the ways forward that we need to take to understand some of these ideas. So let's begin. You all must have heard this term now, decolonizing economics, Eurocentrism in economics, in so many spaces. And it's very important to kind of take a step back and talk about what is it that is Eurocentric about economics as a discipline, right? And I'm sure many of you have thought about it and have your own ideas about it. One of the kind of idea that and a lot of my co-authors working on this theme kind of work with is this idea where the endogenous capitalist development in Europe and the associated Enlightenment values of rationality, objectivity based on these Enlightenment values were considered as the locus. So, this is what was considered, that there was indeed an endogenous capitalist development in Europe, and it came with all these ideas of rationality and objectivity. And realities everywhere else in the world were seen as mere deviations from this European experience. So that is how much of economics kind of tries to understand much of the themes prevalent in it. However, this understanding of the European experience is partial. Why is it partial? Because A, it was not an endogenous capitalist development that happened in Europe, right? Like it was, it did depend a lot on the role of colonialism, which was about extraction of value, extraction of resources, using markets, and a lot of exploitation that happened in a lot of colonized economies of the world. Similarly, it was not endogenous because it depended on various other structural form of oppressions. What were these structural form of oppressions that I'm talking about? Barring, of course, colonialism as one of the process, there was also various racialized processes. There was transatlantic slave trade. There was the creation of this racialized subject who could be enslaved or could be paid lower wages at other instances, etc. So all of that kind of went hand in hand with creating this capitalist development in Europe, what we understand to be development today. However, there has been an exclusion of all of these understandings of how capitalist development takes place concomitantly with processes like colonialism, other forms of structural oppressions, etc. And all of those ideas are kind of excluded and obfuscated in the standard narratives of economics and economic development. And how does that happen? I'll talk about it in just a while. But that idea, if that kind of is the locus of our understanding of economic development, which is that of a partial view of how endogenous capitalist development in Europe unfolded, and looking at that as the universal experience and judging all other economies by simply as an aberration or deviation from it, we understand that to be Eurocentric in nature. Now, how is it that this project of economic development or development economics as a discipline that we talk about comes into being? I don't know how many of you have heard about this Nobel laureate Arthur Lewis, who won the Nobel in economics in 1954 for the paper on unlimited supplies of labor. And that kind of became like a very defining feature or a defining work on how development is supposed to be understood. So, how was it understood? The difference in a developed economy and a less developed economy was seen to be in terms of its economic structures. So that is what will distinguish between what we call a developed versus a less developed economy. A less developed economy was particularly characterized by an economic dualism in the economic structure. What do I mean by an economic dualism? It is when the economic structure is one where there's a coexistence of a huge traditional agricultural pre-capitalist informal sectors with a much smaller modern industrial capitalist formal sector, where the former set is something that is seen to be low productive without really accumulating much, using low technology, etc. Whereas the modern industrial capitalist formal sectors are, I'm using these terms synonymously. We will get into differentiating some of these, but for now, we can use them synonymously for the purpose that I'm using it for right now. Where the second set is seen to be more productive, is seen to be technologically advanced, is seen to be profit driven. Now, on the other hand, a developed economy was seen to be homogeneously modern, that this dual economic structure, this fragmented economic structure or fractured economic structure, where there are two sets of the economy operating with two distinct organizational structure and motives and logic, where one is not really accumulation driven, but the other is much more accumulation driven, does not quite exist. Whereas where he argued that a developed economy is one where this economic structure is homogeneously modern and more accumulation driven and higher productive. Based on this, the process of economic development was seen as various interrelated processes of structural change in the production structure, in employment, in economic activities, moving away from this dual economic structure that exists or that defines the less developed economies into this homogeneously modern kind of economic structure. And the idea was that there would be a transformation of this dual economic structure with more economic growth, such as to transform the economies along the lines of the advanced capitalist economies. And this kind of becomes the central feature of how the project of development, for all intents and purposes, gets formally initiated and gets imported into economics. The whole discipline of development economics was in some way trying to understand. I don't know if you guys are hearing the disturbance. There's a lot of choppers always flying in the London skies. Okay, great. So what we're talking about is that this kind of idea becomes the central idea of what a development project is supposed to be envisaged as. Now, what is the issue with this sort of a development project? Of course, it's a very interesting one because it does recognize the structural differences between developed and less developed economies. Interestingly, however, as a side note, the whole discipline of development economics kind of comes into being as a way to study these deviant economies where these normal, quote unquote, normal economic principles and economics dynamics doesn't really work out. So to come back to our story, in this framework that I spoke about, it is hinged upon the acceptance of certain Western concepts and values as the benchmarks. And one very central idea, which I'll point to as the Eurocentric idea. It was understood that development was supposed to be something that had to be brought into existence, but this underdeveloped, which is the dual economic structure, was seen to be a naturally occurring one. However, that is where we take issue with that it wasn't that only development was something that had to be actively acted upon to be brought about. Rather, even the underdevelopment in all these less developed economies was something that was actively brought about, or its form was actively brought about through processes of colonialism, racialization, etc., and so on. So it is not that there was a naturally occurring underdeveloped, untouched world of green pastures or somewhere out there, but rather it was based on extreme extraction from these colonies that was happening, that on one hand created the developed economies, and on the other hand created the economic structure of the underdeveloped economies, which is why that entire kind of framework of development that becomes the basis of it is something that we classify as Eurocentric. Now, following that, the entire process of development became like a huge techno-bureaucratic exercise, which was one of requiring policy adjustments, that how these impediments to realize economic growth, which can bring about the structural transformation, can be brought about, as if it was only a techno-bureaucratic process. And there's this very nice quote where by Amartya Sen, another of the Nobel laureate, who says that these countries were supposed to have only interests and no passions. So the entire development exercise is like, these are the 10 right policies. This policy mix, if you impose, it's going to be work out great in terms of development. Any kind of contradiction that was supposed to emerge from this development process, people being dispossessed, etc., was kind of just wished away by thinking that the gains of the entire growth and development process will take into account all that we were losing out on. But that, of course, as I'll show, probably didn't quite happen. Now, later development economics as a discipline post 70s is not always about recognizing it's those structural differences between the developed and the developing economy. To some extent, it still does. But a lot of post 70s then comes with this idea we need to probably forget about this idea of transformation. Rather, economic system everywhere around the world works pretty much similarly. There's not really structural specificities of developing economies. Rather, what we need to focus on is how can we align our resources and individual characteristics, tweak behaviors, and create better market incentives so that people and firms can better complement the functioning of an already existing, even if not a fully developed capitalist economic structure. And that is where much of the debate that comes, much of the literature that comes in terms of RCTs, nudging of individual behaviors, providing interventions to provide better markets, to provide better information, comes with that idea that, look, everybody in the world, there's no difference in how production is organized, there's no difference in a lot of this work organization stuff. You just need to have better markets, better information, and better individuals with the right kind of rationality, so to say. So that is how the two phases of development can very crudely be categorized, both of which, however, remain functioning around that locus of a partial view of how development happened that I started off with. Of course, there are alternatives to this Eurocentric ideas of development, and I'll unpack some of them in much more detail. But as I said earlier, there have been ideas, especially let's say coming from dependency theories, etc., where the idea is that development and underdevelopment was produced as a result of a common historical process. For example, there were forced transfer of resources to the colonizing economies from the colonies, which facilitated industrialization in the former colonies while inhibiting pathways or indigenous pathways of capitalist development or in these colonies. Other kind of alternative ideas say that it is usually the economic need of the advanced capitalist developed economies that suppress some sort of a transition for the less developed economies. That, okay, you actually need agriculture imports coming from a lot of these less developed economies, so you actually don't want them to industrialize. Or even in the value chain literature, you see a lot of developing economies remaining stuck at the lower end of the value chains, which can be something which is given the more power of developed countries in the market is something that's desirable so that you can have cheap access of a lot of these goods available. And then, of course, there are other strands which says that, look, even if we forget this international dimension, the nature of growth process itself in various developing economies today is of the kind that there's a continued reproduction of this dualism, the dual economic structure, which in itself is something that we see as marking the conditions of underdevelopment. So there is something internal to the process in these economies itself. And in there comes this issue of informal economy. I'll define it and I'll say why this is an important illustration that we need to look at. But I'll pause briefly for anyone to ask me questions about any clarification up till now. And if you've actually been able to follow what I'm saying, um, just give me a thumbs up so that I know to go ahead. Okay. I see two thumbs up on the screen, and I'm going to take that as a go ahead. Great. So, no questions up till now, right? Okay. Feel free to mute yourself and ask if you would like. Unmute yourself, sorry. Don't mute or ask. Okay. So going ahead, I'm going to talk about informal economy. Now, informal economy as a term is something that for the longest time when I started doing my PhD, it was widely understood when I would talk about it in a developed country context, because it wasn't that prevalent. But now it's easier for me to convey to a developed country context because of how prevalent it has become. And that, in fact, says something a lot about the development process. I don't know what are the exact app-based companies that probably work as food delivery services, but let's say in London we've got the Uber food delivery services or Deliveroo food delivery services, etc. Or you may have various of these kind of gig and platform work that kind of exists, and that is some of the way to kind of start thinking about what informal economy looks like. Broadly, it can be categorized into two parts. One part is all those enterprises or firms that exist in an economy that usually the official definition is less than 10 total workers, but broadly what it looks like is that having no wage worker and mostly organizing production using family workers. So there's no actual existence of capital wage labor sort of relationship. Rather, a lot of this is governed by trying to satisfy the subsistence needs of the household rather than really being able to grow and accumulate. So that's one part in terms of the firms, the informal firms that exist. If, you know, something that might be easier to kind of understand is like a small corner shop that remains a corner shop throughout, whatever number of years. A small, like from an Indian context, which is where I grew up and what I study, is a small banana cart person at the side of the road selling bananas every other day, or a small mechanic at the side of the road, fixing your bike or your car or whatever. And a lot of these people do not really grow in their scale, and in terms of the profits that they earn. Whatever increase is there is usually directed towards subsistence rather than towards accumulating and growing their firm. So that is what one can look at as one part of the informal economy, which is usually the self-employed household enterprises. The second part is the informal wage work, which is increasingly a new trend, which is that you are in wage employment but without any longer term wage contract. A lot of these could be daily wage worker. A huge proportion of the Indian economy is in fact like a casual daily wage worker. A lot of construction workers that get hired are on these daily wage, etc. Now, why is this set important? This set is important is because the idea initially was that as this transition from the dual economic structure would happen towards a homogeneously developed kind of economy, or a homogeneously modern capitalist economy, while there were people who transitioned out of agriculture in a large quantity, they didn't quite get employed in industrial formal sector of the economy. In fact, what started happening was a lot of these people, even when they moved to urban areas trying to look for jobs in this formal sector and were dispossessed from their agricultural lands, a lot of them had to, not being able to find secure jobs in the formal industrial segment, had to reproduce their very informal ways of livelihoods within the urban segment. And, a very old article of T.G. McGee in the 1970s categorizes these people as peasants in the cities because they had the same sort of peasant system of production, which was low productive, subsistence driven, not really accumulating, undertaking production using only family labor, etc., now being recreated even in the urban industrial segment, which earlier was supposed to be this way of secure wage employment, etc., which these people didn't really have. Now, this comes as a roadblock in that entire development process that we started out with, because to a lot of people's astonishment, this is not what development was supposed to look like. You were supposed to transition from that old kind of archaic dual structure to this new form of homogeneous kind of modern economic structure. But that didn't happen. Rather, you saw these banana cart people, the mechanic people and stuff, while they are doing, let's say, non-agricultural stuff, or engaging in service economy or manufacturing economy, but with the same production structures and same similar productivity levels that small peasants, etc., would do in agricultural economy. So your economic structure, even if moving away from agriculture, wasn't really shifting. And to kind of just give you an idea, 50% of Indian economy, one of the fastest growing economy since, for last 3 decades, having 8% growth rates per year, and that's the scale we're talking about. 50% of India's workforce is employed in these self-employed activities, that is undertaking production only using family labor, etc., which includes both agriculture and non-agriculture. And in terms of the total informal economy, if you include both wage employment and self-employment, it's somewhere more than, by varying estimates, between 70 to 80% of Indian economy. So I'm not talking about illegal economy by any means. I mean like actual legal ways of producing life, but just very small in scale and extremely precarious. So that's why Indian economy becomes interesting, because it's had experienced this high sustained economic growth, but huge persistence of informality. I already talked about the heterogeneity in informal sector, and I'm going to look at focus on this to try and understand what could be an alternative way in which this development process is unfolding in these countries. So that's why informal economy, and that's where it intervenes. So of course, informality existed. The literature started debating, oh, why does it exist? There were certain, this is in mainstream, I broadly categorized it into two different kinds of explanations. One was the dualist view. Dualist view was still of the kind where they said that, yeah, informal sector and the formal sector actually have very two distinct structural logics in terms of, with the old kind of dualism. It still had that, even if now it's occurring in the urban and the industrial space. But their idea was that, look, it's just a temporary holding ground of the excess labor force, and that would eventually be kind of absorbed with expansion and with more growth in the economy. Then there were other strands, which were the continuum strands, etc., which were basically saying, look, you can't actually look at these firms as low, as simply not really accumulation driven, etc. Rather, they are very micro entrepreneurial and dynamic in nature, but they're just constrained because of various non-availability of credit, non-availability of markets, etc. So you need to simply release these growth constraints for them to be able to grow. On the other hand, were some heterodox traditions. I'm going to skip over this slide, I'll come back to it. There were some heterodox traditions which were talking about, no, actually, these segments have existed because the formal capitalist segment needs it to exist. So there's a need of for them to exist. What was the need? It could provide cheap inputs into the production that's happening in the formal capitalist sector. It could be a way to have cheap labor being available for that kind of a production, because you might know this concept of the reserve army, where broadly speaking, when the labor supply in a country or in any sector is greater than the labor demand, you can push down the wages of the workers, right? So you have this huge pool of workers readily available to work, so you can push down the wages of those currently working. And then, there were also arguments, again, coming from some world systems independency kind of arguments, which were saying that these informal economies or the structure of the developing economies, whether what kind of a structure they would maintain will mainly be structured around what kind of interest it can serve for the core or the developed economies. Now, I'm going to talk about two others, and then I'm going to go to one of the frameworks that I find most interesting and show you some data from India. What were these other kind of perspectives? For example, David Harvey, some of you might have heard of him, a big kind of Marxist geographer theorist, who says that, look, these spaces, these kind of informal economic spaces or the non-capitalist spaces, exist precisely. And the reason I refer to some of this. Okay, I should clarify this. Informal economy, as we said, consists of these two parts, the informal wage employment and informal self-employment. A lot of theorists have called the informal self-employment as non-capitalist spaces. To remind you again, when we were talking about the dualism that Lewis was talking about, he's talking about two different production structure, the informal, non-capitalist, traditional sort of structure vis-a-vis a modern capitalist sort of structure. And the difference is that one is more driven by accumulation, has wage workers, hires workers, etc., while the other is low productive, does not accumulate, etc. So that's, and within the informal economy, a huge proportion, a significant proportion of it is actually these, what we call the non-capitalist spaces. So I might use them sometimes interchangeably, so bear with me. Works of David Harvey, etc., have basically shown that many a times you might need these spaces to exist to invest over accumulated surplus in different places. And I'm going to skip over this. So one of the really interesting ways to now think about how the development trajectory, why the development trajectory might not be that unilinear transformation or structural transformation that Lewis was talking about, the need to think about it came, as I said, with this roadblock of informality that came into it. Different people have tried to explain what would happen or why this informality persists by different ways. A very important kind of insight that continues in the literature is that, look, with more economic growth, with more expansion, this would actually wither away. Now, there's an alternate strand which takes a very non-Eurocentric position and says, look, there's no reason for the development in these quote-unquote developing economies to happen in the way it happened for the first world, because there were a lot of contingent conditions that existed, and there are a lot of different conditions that exist for the developing economies. And he argues, particularly drawing from the works of Kalle and Sanyal, this framework argues that what if the nature of development process is not that of this linear movement, but rather of a different kind? And what is that different kind is something that they unpack. Where they're saying, when you look at an economic system, let's say the system we're living in is capitalism, it can comprise of different kinds of production processes, both capitalist as well as non-capitalist. As I have clarified earlier, by capitalist production processes, I mean those that have a capital wage labor relation, that are more accumulation driven, while non-capitalist are the ones, which is majority of the informal economy, are the one which is does not have a capital wage labor relation, are not accumulation driven, etc. And he's saying that the economic system comprises of both of these. And he says that the way development process in these economies unfolded was that while the process of growth and expansion, right, when an economy is growing and expanding, it did take away resources from these traditional agricultural non-capitalist segments, but did not really absorb the people who dependent on it. think about agricultural segments, peasant economies. You take away the land, you take away the market, etc., but don't really absorb the labor that were dependent on these resources. Now, this labor that is now dispossessed from their land and resources have to find a way to survive one way or another. And the way they do it is by trying to recreate their conditions of livelihood in what we call the informal economy, in, let's say, a lot of urban spaces, industrial spaces, not in agriculture, but again in these extremely precarious ways, organizing their production with organizing their production mainly using family labor, etc. So the expectation in development was that no, there would be dispossession of these people from agriculture, but the idea was that these people would be absorbed in the expanding formal capitalist segment. But he's saying that no, probably that's actually not what defines the current growth and development process in the developing economies, but rather this process remains ever incomplete and always ongoing. What do we mean by always ongoing and ever incomplete? That the capitalist growth process always encroaches upon these non-capitalist segments without absorbing those dispossessed in the process. This excluded population is then forced to recreate its conditions of livelihood as informal non-capitalist segment, and therefore the economic dualism that, according to Lewis, was supposed to go away with economic growth continues to be reproduced, but now in newer forms, in newer ways. Okay, by newer forms, I just mean like new work, new people kind of occupy these spaces, new kind of production activities come, but that dual economic structure in terms of the coexistence of a large traditional non-capitalist informal and a much smaller modern capitalist segment continues to be reproduced with the majority of the workforce subsisting in this kind of informal non-capitalist spaces. And this I've talked about. And one point that he raises quite clearly, which is quite in contrast to a lot of other works, says that those who occupy these spaces of the informal non-capitalist spaces, they're actually probably just the sheer size of it is so huge, they're probably not even needed for the capitalist growth process to either suppress their wages or for any other task. Rather, they are redundant for any economic need for the growth of the capitalist segment. So now let me show you some illustrations from India. At this point, again, any questions? So I can pause and clarify, because I know I gave a lot of theoretical context there in a very compressed manner. So let me know if there's clarifications before I move ahead. Cool. So let me come to the illustrations from India. I already spoke about persistent informality despite high economic growth. I focus on the peak growth period in India. I look at the period between 2004 and 2005 and 11-12 using India Human Development Survey, which is a country level representative data set. And what I do is I analyze the patterns of household level transitions between different sectors of the economy based on where is it that the household is receiving its primary income, like the major income of the household. It's a panel of 40,000 households, which is representative of the entire country. Right. So let me start by categorizing households based on their primary income sources. I've already, and I'll see something as a transition if there is a shift in the sector from which the household derives its primary economic dependence. Now, I'm able to divide the economy into various sectors. These acronyms can get tedious, so don't worry. I will keep explaining for whatever reason, to whatever extent it is important to stay with the argument. Now, I'm looking at the first set in the informal sector space is agricultural self-employed and non-agricultural self-employed, which for me are both this traditional non-capitalist sector that I was talking about, right? Because they are organizing production without any wage labor, using only household work and mainly subsistence driven. So it could be agricultural self-employed. Imagine agricultural self-employed as a peasant tilling the land and selling the produce in the market, and then so selling the produce in the market, but not really undertaking, not making a lot of profits for expansion, etc., but rather using it mainly for subsistence. And then you have the non-agricultural self-employed. Think of the mechanic corner shop at this or a banana cart person. Then you have within wage labor space, agricultural wage labor and non-agricultural wage labor. These is casual wage labor who are paid income on a daily basis, right? Like that's the amount of precarity, like not really a long-term contract. And then you have a formal or an upper tier formal. The boundaries are a bit murky. So there you have the employer households, that is those who are like employing workers. So let's say I run a factory and I employ workers to come, which will be a capitalist sort of enterprise. Then you have the salaried non-casual labor, which is workers who are paid on somewhat of a regular basis and have slightly longer term contracts. And then there's the other household, which is not really people actively in the workforce, but it could be receiving pensions and dividends, etc. So this is what, in terms of the primary economic dependence, the Indian economy looks like in terms of the households. And what we're looking at, what I want you to kind of focus on here is this is non-agricultural self-employed, agricultural self-employed. Again, remember our non-capitalist kind of spaces, a huge non-agricultural wage labor, and agricultural wage labor, which is the casual wage labor kind of sectors. And for 2005 and 2011-12, the brown kind of, or for each of the stacks, the one on the left is for 2011, and the one on the right is one for 2011-12. Broad takeaway for leaving the other sector for all the sectors in the economy, there hasn't been a much shift in the proportion of people or households deriving their primary income from each of these sectors, which might not be surprising given the time frame that we are looking at. Let's now turn this and let's look at from each of the household, what is the proportion of households, from each of the sector, what is the proportion of households that transition towards another sector in between this period. So now you remember, this is your non-agricultural, this was the first graph, non-agricultural self-employed, the proportion of households deriving their primary income from non-agricultural self-employed remained at about 9 to 10% between 5 and 11, 12. Now you look at the other graph. About 68% people, the first graph is showing you, from non-agricultural self-employed actually transition towards another sector for their primary income. But this was replaced by other sets of household transitioning from all other sectors back into this non-agricultural self-employed. So what we, and this I've mapped even in terms of individual level occupational changes and stuff, and much of it does hold except for some difference in agriculture. But what we are saying is from each of the sector from where the households derive their livelihoods, a huge proportion transitions towards another sector, while that same sector is being reconstituted by other households transitioning towards this sector. So there's this huge or underlying this kind of stable economic structure of the Indian economy is this huge movement or churn that happens as households and people constantly transition across different sectors of the economy to derive their livelihoods. Um, and again, they're transitioning towards all sectors, and then there are people coming towards it from all sectors. So this graph is just kind of showing it. I don't need to get into it. This is like something that I did recently with the high frequency labor market data for the Indian economy. And here again, what we're seeing, I mean, broadly, these are trajectories over time for people moving to different sectors. And again, one thing to take away is there's this huge flux that people are constantly moving from one sector to another and back, which is both sectoral shifts and job shifts. I'm aware that we're kind of just have 5 more minutes before I need to stop talking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rush through some of the results. But one thing that the next step that I'm looking at is what is the nature of these transitions, right? Like I'm saying that this is huge volume of households that are constantly, and people that are constantly moving across sectors. What is the nature of this? In general, in the Indian economy, the consumption per capita, which can be a measure of well-being, has been increasing for people. Now, so by that, everybody is doing slightly better off. But this is between period 5 to 11, 12. there's other debated data for after this period of whether people's, to what extent people's incomes did rise. So to get to the nature of transitions, I don't think I'll be able to go through the whole exercise, but what I've tried to do is kind of try to look at for every sector, from every sector, there we have two sets: households that transitions and households that did not transition. I look at the households that did transition and create a counterfactual of what their consumption levels would have been had they not transitioned, and if they had stayed in the same sector and were getting similar returns to their characteristics and as the non-transitioning set, and look at what is it that their actual consumption level is compared to this counterfactual consumption level. The results are quite interesting, and what we see here is that the results are basically as expected. If you move towards, let's say, a non-capitalist self-employed segment, you will be doing worse off. If you're moving towards the casual wage labor sector, you'll be doing further worse off, so on and so forth. And by this metric, about 62% of transitions in this kind of transitions in the economy for people are actually worse off. I do a bunch of robustness check, trying to make the counterfactual better, etc., which I can come to if there are any questions. But where is it that we reach to from here? There is a substantial proportion of households that have transitioned, despite which the overall economic structure of the country has remained more or less intact. There is a continuous regeneration of different economic spaces, including the traditional informal sector, the non-capitalist segments, as well as the casual wage employment of the economy. And these are sectors that were often expected to dissolve over time with economic growth. Rather, we see them being continuously regenerated with unfavorable transitions. Ideally, if you would have not transitioned and continued to have the same kind of conditions that you had as the non-transitioning set, you would have actually been able to do better. But now you've had to transition, and so the transitions are unfavorable. And despite so much movement across economic sectors, it does not imply an integration, but rather the economic spaces have remained segmented. And despite this segmentation, despite this overall economic structure remaining fragmented and fractured, we do see a lot of these transitions. So what's our takeaway? The takeaway that I'm trying to get at, and this entire paper is a much longer paper with a lot more empirical support for the claims, but what I'm trying to argue here is that despite economic growth of the Indian economy that we've seen, there has been a continued regeneration of informal economy, particularly the non-capitalist segments of the economy, as well as informal wage labor, which at the very instance was supposed to wither away with economic growth. And their reproduction has happened with a lot of these unfavorable transition. So it is this embedded dynamism in the process that is continuously reproducing a fractured structure and the non-capitalist spaces and the conditions of informality rather than due to lack of it. So it's not with lack of growth. In some sense, the study is departing both from mainstream as well as non-mainstream strands, which is saying that the growth process is inclusionary or it's exclusionary. But rather, we do find some resonance with the framework of Sanel that we were talking about, that this excluded population, in some senses, like this, there's a term that Jan Bremen uses, which is called the footloose labor. There's a workers constantly trying to move across these economic segments in search for secure livelihoods, but are not able to, and in the process, they continuously reproduce these traditional informal spaces for their survival, and this this continued reproduction of non-capitalist spaces that Lewis was but I mean these non-capitalist spaces is not simply an existence of a space in the past, but sorry, I should clarify that a little more. This reproduction of the non-capitalist spaces is not simply um, a, a continued existence of a space that did not wither away with growth, but rather we're talking about these being continuously recreated with the growth process. And therefore, we need to kind of understand this contradictory nature of the process that continuously creates conditions of underdevelopment rather than that teleological sort of unilinear movement that we were expecting to happen, aping the process of what happened, aping the quote unquote partial experience of development in the first world. Um, and the fact that with this process of growth, there's a recreation of the spaces and of structure that were originally expected to dissolve, we call into question this imaginary of transition through the process of capitalist development, which, as I started with earlier, kind of becomes the locus of a Eurocentric idea of what development was supposed to be. And I'll stop there. Thank you.